Greetings, everyone. This is Joyce Davis, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, coming to you again with another great decisions discussion. We are absolutely thrilled today. The topic is one thing that will thrill you because people want to know what's going on with China and what is the relationship that is developing, good, bad, or ugly, it looks like, between China and the United States. But what I'm really delighted about is that we have a true international affairs expert with us, someone who's going to know what he's talking about, and that's Colonel Jerad Harper. And Colonel, I'm going to give them a little bit of your extensive bio and background before we start the video and you do your remarks. But for now, just please feel welcome and thank you for being a part of us. Great. Okay, and so what we're going to do now, I hope you have paid, those who are tuning in, coming in now, I hope you have paid attention to some of the things that were on the screen, because we have several wonderful events that are coming up, including a 3-day celebration of Women's History Month coming up in March. And our part of that, we're collaborating with the Civic Club. And on that Saturday, we're going to have an International Women's Conference that will be going on at the Civic Club. So we hope you will check that out on our website. But for now, why don't we sit back, get ready to at least view this opening film produced by the Foreign Policy Association, and then we will engage with our expert speaker, Colonel Harper, after that. And again, a thanks to Frederickson Library for sponsoring this important discussion series. So are you able to share and get our video going for us, Cameron?
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2023, an 8-lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. We continue to work through our Great Decisions challenges. Here in week number 3, our focus is on China and its relationship to the United States. When we think about the foreign policy of any nation in the world, there are 3 core elements that go into that foreign policy calculation. On the one hand, there are the capabilities of the country. What can it achieve? What is it capable of obtaining in the world around it? Next, we have the interest of the country. It's quite possible that interest and capabilities do not align. Sometimes nations have a much greater capability than they have interest, and at other times their interest outstrip their capabilities to accomplish them. And then finally, we look at the leadership of the country, its competence, its ability. Beginning with capabilities. As we think about China, there are 3 elements of capability. The first is population, which has always been very large, and it has grown significantly over the course of the 20th and now into the 21st century. Economically, the Chinese began to catch up with the rest of the world in the 1980s and have continued to do so into the 21st century. And then finally, militarily, all of that investment in the post-Mao Zedong era has paid off for China. Its military is increasingly modern, diversified, and far-reaching in its capabilities. So we think about capabilities in China, and they're clearly on the upside. Next comes interest. What does China want, and what has China always wanted? If we go back to the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and consistently since then, a core interest of the country is the survival of the Chinese Communist Party, the party of Mao, the party of Xi. This may seem like an obvious observation, but in the United States, it's not a core interest to keep Democrats or Republicans in power, nor in Canada, in France, or any other democracy. Our core interests are in the peaceful and managed transition of power among political parties. But for China, it's authoritarian. It's all about one-party rule and the centrality of the Communist Party. Beyond that, early on, China wanted to consolidate its control over internal territories. It considers internal to be Tibet, the western regions where the Uyghur live, and even Taiwan. So internals in quotation marks because not all of the world acknowledges that those territories are really part of China. recognition of Red China as the sole and legitimate representative of the Chinese people was next, followed by great power status, and then possibly leadership in the international system. There's much talk of China aiming to be the dominant power in the world, surpassing the United States in both power and authority. We don't know that for a certainty. It's quite possible that China's ambitions are no greater than great power status. And whether it seeks great power status alone or global leadership to become the hegemon of the system is the truly million-dollar question, because the way that we confront, agree with, and disagree with China varies greatly on those two different scenarios. So in terms of interest, whatever they are, they're certainly on the upward trend line. And then finally, we have leadership, which will be the focus of this brief lecture. And with the leadership of China, we see something very interesting happening. It's almost a return to the 1950s. The leadership in 2023 tends to associate itself more with Mao and his early supporters than it does with Deng or any of the other leaders since 1976. We have three main considerations before we look at U.S. foreign policies relating to China. We'll look at them in terms of leadership positions: Mao, the Chinese Communist Party; Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy; and then finally the present leader of the country, Mr. Xi. And as I noted earlier, Xi's approach to foreign policy has much more in common with the Maoist than with those during the Deng era. The evolving foreign policy actually begins with a non-communist, and that is Chiang Kai-shek. He was in power when World War II ended. He is pro-Western and therefore categorically distinct from the communists that succeeded him. When he lost power in 1949, it was to Mao Zedong, who was profoundly anti-Western in his approach, an ideologue believing in the constant struggle in pursuit of a non-capitalist state, ending the division of people into workers and owners of the modes of production. Deng Xiaoping, much more pragmatic. He emerges in the late 1970s, stays in power for a decade's time, and he's thinking more about how to advance the interest of China within the context of an American-dominated global system. And therefore, Deng was more willing to cooperate with the United States and its Western allies. Finally, we have Xi, who looks more like the old Chinese Communist Party than a pragmatist. And in many ways, he's taking China backward in time, reeling in many of its international obligations and its presence abroad. We can draw a strong line between Mao and Deng, between the ideologue and the pragmatist, as well as a very strong dividing line between Deng and Xi. The final element of foreign policy, in addition to capabilities, interest, and leadership, is the external element. Because nation states don't operate in a vacuum. They're conducting foreign policy within the context of an ever-changing geostrategic arena. If you have the winds at your back, it does make life a lot easier. Fewer things are resisting you. There are fewer obstacles to overcome, and that is categorically distinct from facing crosswinds, where what you're doing is somewhat at odds with the preference of the international system. And then finally, we have the confrontational model, where a nation state is pursuing policy in one direction, which is completely opposed by either larger, more powerful nations or a collection of other nations in the system. Putting them all together, we have the global currents, leadership, interest, and capabilities. It is within that box that foreign policy is constructed. Leadership in China will be the focus of this lecture. China is such a complex nation, and its relationship with the world is so multifaceted, we could easily spend all 8 Great Decisions lectures looking at a different aspect of China and its foreign policy. Today we focus on leadership, and we begin with Mao Zedong. Mao came to power as a revolutionary. While Chiang Kai-shek and the other Chinese were fighting the Japanese in their occupation of China in the 1940s, Mao was walking the land, meeting people, preaching the good word of his ideology, which is called Maoism, and assembling an army so that when the Second World War ended, he was ready for war for the leadership of China. It is a battle that he won. His little red book was everywhere in schools, in society. The thoughts, the quotations of Mao were common and mandatory reading for all people of China. He was establishing a cult of the personality. He also sought the desire of consolidating China, having it recognized in the international community, and confronting the reality that the government that he defeated, the KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, the pro-Western Chinese leader, had moved over to Taiwan across the Formosa Straits and was claiming to represent all of the people living in the purple area in mainland China. So for Mao, it was all about diplomatic recognition, having that recognition shifted from Taiwan over to mainland China, fighting wars on the periphery, and then confronting two very powerful nuclear superpowers in the form of the Soviet Union and the United States. The first peripheral war happened in 1950. In June of that year, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. They advanced very quickly. The United States responded with a rescue mission using Japan as a launching point and really battling quite successfully under MacArthur to push the North Korean communists back across the dividing line and into the orange areas. The problem for us is that MacArthur misread Beijing's intentions. We never anticipated that Mao would send his military into the conflict. When he did so, the United States fell back all the way down to Busan, the longest U.S. retreat in American military history. 1950 to 53, the Korean War stands out because that is a great power war, which is defined as a war involving at least one great power on each side. We have not had a great power war since 1953, which is the longest period of peace among the great powers in modern world politics. Should the United States, France, or the United Kingdom get directly involved in the war in Ukraine, then that would be a great power war and break the very long peace among them. The next war on the periphery happened just south, and that is, of course, Vietnam. The United States took over from France in the 1950s fully by 1964, and we fought a ground war against Chinese-supported North Vietnamese. It was an incredibly long and painful war for the United States, one that we would ultimately lose, leaving the country in 1973 and then watching from the sidelines as the Vietnamese unify under Hanoi's rule in 1975. China was involved directly or indirectly in both the Korean and the Vietnamese War. In 1971, the United Nations General Assembly took up the question of recognition. Up until this point, the United States and its allies had rallied enough countries in the world to support Taiwan as the legitimate voice of the Chinese people. But so many new countries were entering the United Nations in Asia and Africa in particular, that China was able to break through that 2/3 majority needed to shift the recognition over from Taiwan to mainland China. That happens in 1971, and for the first time, Communist China is officially recognized as the government of China and the representative of the Chinese people. China confronted those two superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And while we never did battle directly with one another, the Cold War was an intense military struggle between the two polar opposite sides. China had to make choices. As clearly the weakest of the three, it could not confront either one of them, so it had to pick sides. It did so initially by joining the Soviet Union in the 1940s, 50s, and 1960s. The communist ideology bound them together, but in reality, this was a geostrategic calculation by Beijing. And over time, as the interests and capabilities of China changed, and of course the world around it did as well, China began to gravitate away from the Soviet Union, to the point that the Soviets were openly thinking about perhaps bombing China's nuclear capabilities. The two did not bind themselves by ideology any longer. they began to separate based upon geostrategic calculations. By the end of Mao's rule, China had positioned itself equally between the Americans and the Russians in an effort to escape the shadow of Moscow and also to create its own profile, its own presence in global politics. This was reflected in the famous meeting between Mr. Nixon and Mao in the early 1970s. The thought of an American president visiting China, Red China, Communist China, the same country that killed Americans in Korea and Vietnam, was unthinkable only a year or so after the war in Vietnam was coming to a close. But it happened because Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon were realists. Conservative foreign policy advocates, they believed that great powers should work together as opposed to one another. The Shanghai Communique reflects the new American position. There is but one China, and Taiwan is part of that China. Unification of the two Chinas should be through peaceful means. This was our signal and commitment to fully recognize mainland China under Mao as the sole and legitimate representative of the country. Throughout his reign, Mao Zedong sought recognition from the world, including the United States. He fought those difficult and expensive wars on the periphery, and he found ways to maneuver in and around the superpower Cold War conflict. He passes in 1976, a major state affair, of course. The torch passes on to Deng Xiaoping, who has a completely different view of China and its place in the world. He envisions a China that is modern, integrated, prosperous, and influential. He was vilified by the Cultural Revolution that was launched in 1966. It lasted until Mao Zedong's death. This was an effort by Mao to purify the country by identifying those Chinese citizens who were not loyal to the Communist Party and the teachings of Mao Zedong. But in many ways, this is a simple clearing out of adversaries, fending off political rivals by targeting them and isolating them. Deng Xiaoping was targeted. He was forced off into a re-indoctrination camp to get his mind right and bring him back fully into the communist fold. Under Deng, China both modernized and pursued a pragmatic foreign policy. Economically, a smashing success. Investments were made on the coastline. Many of the major cities along the coastline were allowed a special economic zone qualification, which meant they could abandon some communist principles and freely trade with the rest of the world. Major investments in the military paid off handsomely. The only area of modernization that was not affected by Deng was political. It remained a one-party country. Only the Communist Party was legitimate, and there could be no challenges at a high political level or by the people to challenge the Communist Party and its policies. This was reflected in the very harsh military crackdown in 1989 at Tiananmen Square, where roughly 1 million people came out, not denouncing Deng Xiaoping or the Communist Party, but simply asking for more freedom, more liberty, and more voice in terms of the direction of the Chinese. Deng Xiaoping in 1989 steps away, but on the path to that retirement came a number of important foreign policy approaches, the most prominent of which is called utilitarianism. This means doing what is good for China and China alone, not thinking about global obligations and not thinking about the communist ideology. Deng was famous for saying, "It doesn't matter the stripes of the cat as long as it catches a mouse," which is a Chinese way of saying ideology really isn't that important. It's all about the outcome. Be pragmatic and secure China's interest. He formalized relations with the United States that was started under Mao. He supported the first Gulf War in 1990-91. China was on the council with veto power. It could have rejected any of the measures taken to condemn Saddam Hussein, to sanction Iraq economically, or to authorize a military intervention, which happened in January 1991. and he entered China into the great power. I should note that Deng stayed in power only until 1989, a full 2 years before that first Gulf War. But the Deng era, which began in 78, really lasted until 2012 because Deng Xiaoping handpicked his successors. Looking at the ideological role in foreign policy, for Mao, it was supreme. It was top of the line. For Deng, it was all about technocrats, not finding ideologues to run the country, but people who understood economics, infrastructure development, banking, and finance. With Xi, we've seen something of a mix in the first 2 5-year terms he has enjoyed. Now that he's in power for another 5 years, this box is going to turn increasingly red, as Xi looks more like the Mao early supporters than a 21st century Chinese leader. Let's look now at Xi and his policies. As I mentioned, a mix of technology and ideology. For Mao, it was all about the cult of the personality and rule of one. Under Deng, it was collective leadership. Clearly, Deng was at the top of the food chain, but there were very powerful people sitting around him, making key decisions for the country and being involved in foreign policy making. For Xi, it's back to the rule of one. Everything revolves around Xi. No others have any meaningful role. If they do rise, they find themselves on the outs very quickly. 2 different views of Xi, our perception and what I would call reality. Our perception of Xi for this past 10-year period is that he's a man of great capabilities. He rose on merit by succeeding in his many lower roles in the Communist Party, and he's largely unchallenged as the leader of the country. The reality by China experts is quite different. He rose based upon connections. His track record of decision-making was not very impressive before 2012 and is being highly questioned beyond that. There are growing threats around him. Something of a coming storm is waiting for Xi in his 3rd 5-year term in office. Because when you're all powerful, when you make all of the decisions on behalf of the Communist Party for the country, you are alone responsible for failures. And the failures are becoming increasingly obvious. His COVID lockdown policy has been an utter disaster in China. The economic reforms he has instituted have handcuffed the financial industry and are raising concerns about an economic slowdown. The elites around him are increasingly frustrated by his rule, and the issue of Taiwan remains on a front burner. Mainland China would love to think of Taiwan as a quiet extension of China that eventually will be absorbed into the mainland politically and economically. That simply is not the case in 2023. We now turn our attention to American foreign policy relating to China. As noted in that introductory lecture, there are 4 distinct perspectives that are very popular in the United States these days: liberal, realpolitik, which is conservative, neoconservative, which is not conservative at all, and America First. They have a view of China distinct from one another, and their foreign policies, therefore, are distinct as well. For the liberals, the key is to trade with China. If we trade with China, it deters China from upsetting the apple cart. The more that China is engaged globally in economic trade, the more likely it is that the Communist Party will change with the times. This has been our belief now for 50 years. It has not worked out. We have not affected change inside of China. I'm perfectly fine with that because China can lead itself any way that it wants. It's not really our business to determine who runs the show in Beijing and the direction they take domestically, whether it's authoritarianism or democracy. My focus is always on foreign policy. For the realist, a more conservative view, we cooperate where there are opportunities. We compete with China when that is necessary. The neocons view China as a rising threat to the United States. They consider cooperation measures only modestly, and what they really focus on is beating China down, denying it top-tier status in the world, relegating it to second-tier status, always under the American thumb, and American global leadership. And then we have the America Firsters who want to hit China very hard with economic sanctions. They believe that the American Midwest has decayed over time because industries have been shipped overseas, and they can make a very strong argument for that. Because of Chinese unfair trade practices, China has an unfair advantage. We cannot allow this to continue. So the policy focus for the America Firsters: hit the Chinese hard, force them to play fairly on trade, and then America can be revived economically. The Taiwan question is critical to any discussion of Sino-American relations and U.S. foreign policy towards the Pacific. The common questions are as follows. Will China invade Taiwan? Again, a $1 million 21st century question. Will China launch an amphibious assault against Taiwan? It would be an historic military operation if it were pulled off. We thought about invading Taiwan in the early 1940s when our island hopping strategy of World War II brought us to the edge of the island. When Mr. Roosevelt was informed that to do so would require an amphibious landing even greater than the one being planned for Normandy, the decision to invade was made. We won't do it. It's simply too difficult of an island to conquer. Not a lot has changed since the early 1940s. Taiwan is heavily defended. It has the most modern equipment on the ground, and an invasion by China would be overwhelmingly expensive. We said the same sorts of things about Ukraine and Russia only a year ago. They'll never invade. The task is too great and the costs are too high. Will the U.S. defend Taiwan if China invades it? That commitment was made by Mr. Biden only recently, September of 2022, when asked at a press conference, would the U.S. defend Taiwan? And his answer was yes. This is a clear departure from traditional American foreign policy. And while his aides tried to revise that statement quickly, the cat was out of the bag. The U.S. publicly committed to defending Taiwan militarily should China invade the island. Policy inconsistency has been a hallmark of our policy towards Taiwan now for 50 years. Back in 1972, we made it clear Taiwan is Chinese. It is not independent. The unification must be peaceful, but this is as much a part of China as, say, Texas is to the United States. That's classic realpolitik. That's Kissinger and Nixon. Today, 50 years later, the U.S. president is committing to the defense of Taiwan should it be invaded. This reflects either a liberal perspective, which is that war is no longer acceptable, or a neoconservative warning that China remains on the rise and is a direct threat to American global leadership. Bridging the two, weapon sales of the 1980s and beyond, official visits by high-ranking American officials, and that phone call that Mr. Trump made, his first international call as president in 2017 to the president of Taiwan. These are all indications that we're moving away from the green box, recognizing Taiwan as part of China, and towards the blue box of defending Taiwan should that be necessary. America First is found in between. Rattling the cage of China by calling the Taiwanese president was a way of signaling that we're going to stand up to you, we're going to defend our interests at home, even if that means extending our policy in the Formosa Strait. The right question to ask, and the one that is almost never aired publicly, will America's forced posture and foreign policy increase or decrease the odds that China invades Taiwan? As I look at the scenario of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, given the remarkable costs militarily and economically, I focus on one singular issue, and that is whether the U.S. can resist the urge of encouraging a Taiwanese independent declaration. If Taiwan were to declare independence, and there is a major party in Taiwan that runs on this platform every election, if that were to happen, Taiwan were to declare itself independent, the likelihood of a Chinese invasion goes up substantially. So to me, as an old school realist, a conservative, our policy should really be engineered around lowering the temperature of the Formosa Strait, accepting the reality of Taiwan as part of China, and not encouraging the island to pursue independence. In order to best understand the relationship between the U.S. and China geostrategically, we focused on the Pacific Basin. In 1945, the picture was clear. Japan was vanquished, defeated, and occupied. China was a mess after World War II. A 4-year civil war did not help things at all. The U.S. was able to easily and credibly claim dominance of the entire Pacific Basin. This was our sphere of influence. There were no challengers. 1972, Nixon, Shanghai Communique, the line on the Chinese coastline is going to change to the other side of Taiwan, because now we're recognizing Taiwan as being part of mainland China. When Mr. Biden said in 2022 that we will indeed defend Taiwan if necessary, he was effectively moving that line to the Formosa Strait. This runs directly counter to Chinese claims in Southeast Asia of all of the South China Sea. Many nations in the region complain. Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam all state that China cannot make such expansive claims, as does the United States. China's claims are not supported by international rules and laws. That has not stopped China, however, from building artificial islands in the South China Sea and militarizing them. That leaves the United States with no choice but to challenge China in the region. We must fly our aircraft over those islands and sail our Navy directly next to them, even though each time that we do, China warns us that we're entering Chinese airspace and may be targeted. Statistically speaking, there's going to be a crash or an attack one side against the other in this area of overlap. You can't avoid each other forever. Mistakes do happen. Back in 2001, an American military aircraft collided with a Chinese aircraft. That's the sort of thing that could touch off a crisis that escalates quickly and results in a shooting war between the United States and China. When we decide to extend our dominance claim to the edge of China's coast, we're increasing the likelihood of conflict between the two most powerful of countries in the Pacific. China's not stopping at the 9-dashed line in Southeast China. It is also extending its reach into the Pacific by encouraging countries to switch sides, providing them with economic aid and political support if they will align with Beijing in international organizations such as the United Nations. So the battle for the Pacific is clearly on. The question is whether we can maneuver in such a way as to not increase the likelihood of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan on the one hand, or a direct Sino-American military conflict on the other. At the end of the day, we do not know what China's ambitions are. We know there's great power status, which has been achieved. Do they really want global leadership, which would mean a direct confrontation with the United States? I thank you as always for attending this lecture and look forward to week 4, where we transition into economic warfare as a great decision in 2023. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Well, that was certainly a lot to digest, to say the least. I am now going to call on our distinguished expert here to lead us in our discussion and to help us bring it all home. What does this all really mean for the United States and for Americans? Jerad, am I saying it correct, Jerad? All right, Jerad Harper, PhD, is an active duty U.S. Army colonel and an assistant professor at the U.S. Army War College. He teaches graduate level courses on national security, foreign policy, Middle East, and Indo-Pacific security issues and security cooperation. I will say that he has published in Foreign Policy Parameters and Foreign Policy Research Institute, writing on national security issues. We are really happy that he was able to take time out of his busy schedule to be with us. And just so you know, he has served on staffs at U.S. Central Command and Multinational Force Iraq, and his overseas tours have included Iraq, Afghanistan, and Bosnia. And Colonel Harper, you may know that for several years, I worked with Radio Free Europe, and I supervised broadcast services into Iran and Iraq, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. So we have a little bit in common there. You were on the ground and I was in the airways. But let me turn it over to you now. You heard the video, watched the video. What are your thoughts? Where do you want to take this?
Great. Thanks, Joyce. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. So first of all, just to get out the disclaimer. So everything I share with you tonight these opinions are my own. They're not those of the Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. So you had a great overview from the speaker. I think he really hit a lot of the issues. I do think he got a little bit into his personal opinions when he was talking about our policy options and when he kind of placing the liberal versus neocon and America first in the middle. We can discuss all that as we go forward. But so first of all, what I'd like to do is kind of dive in to some issues that kind of come up to kind of add to what our speaker just shared. So I'm going to share some slides here from my screen, which, can you see this? So I think first of all, your speaker talked about different of the paradigms, different lenses that international relations use. One of those is what we call constructivism, and it really says how we see ourselves as a country matters. And I think this is especially important when you're thinking about a rising China. So first of all, going back into history, and this does matter, China for most of its history was a great power in its region. It was the dominant economic power probably through the 1500s. And that is really important to how they see themselves. They are the Middle Kingdom. They were the masters of their world as they saw it at the time. But really what happened, if you think about as our American experience, is China was not the great power. So from the China sees themselves as just coming out of what they call a century of shame and humiliation, which is, they had a war with the British in 1839, where the British forced them to sell opium there, and then multiple Western countries, gained extensive influence over China. They were invaded by the Japanese. They went through a civil war, and in 1949, the People's Republic of China came to power. So they see themselves as fixing the wrongs of a century, and that they're now going through what they're driving towards this Chinese dream. And Xi Jinping this is his big issue that he's driven, is this great renewal of the Chinese nation. It has a target. The goal is by 2049. Xi's not a young man, he's 67. So I would suggest maybe he probably wants to accomplish that beforehand. Your speaker really talked about how Xi has consolidated power much more than his predecessors since Deng Xiaoping, and really in a way much more like Mao Zedong. So that's really important. So this Chinese dream sees the US as a declining power. If you look at the bottom left, and it is certainly about economic prosperity and a great life for everyone, but it is very much about strength and Chinese power, whether that makes them the preeminent power in 2049 or a preeminent power, it remains to be seen. But clearly they see a different world and a different set of rules than we're presently existing under. So, he talked about realpolitik or realism. So we state our national interest. The Biden administration just came out with its national security strategy, and it doesn't differ in everything from what the PRC calls its core interest. So certainly economic development is a goal for both. And we are tremendously intertwined with China, as everyone knows. Our prosperity is tied to theirs and vice versa. However, some of their goals are also quite dissimilar and create challenges. For example, they define their core interests to include territorial integrity, which doesn't sound like a big deal, except that they define their territory a little different, and it includes territory that they don't presently control. and national reunification. In particular, we're talking about Taiwan is a goal of theirs. So when we're looking at the region, and really certainly China has global aspirations, and we are in competition with them around the world. Note that it's competition, it's not conflict or anything like that, but we are definitely in competition with China today. But in East Asia, where we're most in this, they have massive economic influence. But the US, when we look at it, we see a series of treaty allies. We see Japan, we see Australia, strong diplomatic and security allies. We see the Philippines, which we just renewed a security relationship with, where we'll have US equipment there, and then Thailand, where we do exercises every year. And then Guam. A lot of people, we talk about the homeland and we think the continental United States. Guam is a US territory. Hawaii is a US state, and they are in the Pacific. Now, the PRC looks at this quite differently. When they look east across the Pacific, they see what they call the first island chain. They see Japan, US ally, Taiwan, not theirs, the Philippines, US ally. They look, and then then they feel contained, and they see this second island chain, which includes Guam, the US territory, US military bases, and that is a quite different perspective. So you have two dueling perspectives, and they both matter. So he discussed a couple of these flashpoint regions, and I want to briefly touch on these. So there's really three large flashpoint areas in East Asia where conflict could occur, where there's a lot of significant day-to-day activity going on. And those would be, in general, it's the East China Sea, where I've got number one, the Senkaku Islands, or the Chinese call it the Diaoyu Islands, the Taiwan Straits, Formosa Straits, as he termed them, which is probably the biggest issue, and the South China Sea. He talked about this thing called the 9-dash line, and I'm going to briefly explain what that is. So let's start with that. So the South China Sea is the economic lifeblood of how China gets its energy resources, as well as a massive amount of shipping goes through this on a daily basis. China claims this is the 9-dash line, this area right here. They claim pretty much all of it, and they say that's not the South China Sea, that's the South Sea. It's ours. Now, the problem is everybody else has overlapping claims too. So the Philippines claim the West Philippine Sea out to here. Vietnam claims an area out extensively out to here. You've got Malaysia, Brunei, all these different countries. And then you have what he talked about is the construction of artificial islands. Now, China isn't the only one out there trying to put infrastructure on some of these shoals. And by that, those are not normally this area here we call the Spratly Islands, Scarborough Shoal. These are areas that are in the news sometimes. And there's quite sharp military face-offs or Coast Guard security standoffs. And this is what China has created. So this is an example of Fiery Cross Reef. This was a shoal. It was underwater half the day or most of the day. And China sucked up a bunch of the seafloor and has created a military base. There are a number of these throughout the South China Sea, and you can see there's an airfield, there's port facilities, there's air defense assets. That's not what this is supposed to look like. And so they've created what we say is they're trying to create sovereignty. That's not how the law of the sea works, but it's there. The second is we talk about the Senkaku Islands. These are uninhabited islands just to the northeast of Taiwan. It's important to note that Japan extends all the way down here right up to Taiwan. So a lot of times we think, well, there's Taiwan, there's Japan, but if you're Japanese, you're thinking this is right up on our territory. It's claimed by both Japan and China, and there's a lot of standoffs going on there. And then finally, Taiwan, which is in the news extensively. He talked about, we all saw the recent Pelosi visit where there were Chinese military exercises in response all the way around Taiwan. Many would say that they were showing a potential how they could blockade the island. This isn't the first time, though. Really, the big issue with Taiwan, the shocker for China, happened in 1995 when they did a series of military exercises to sort of intimidate Taiwan. And we sailed 2 carrier groups through the Straits of Taiwan, which was nothing the Chinese could do about at the time, and was basically a blatant show of American power. So the big issue here that comes up is Taiwan. Could the PRC seize Taiwan? Just to kind of put this in scale, it's about 100 miles from the coast of Taiwan. Essentially, it is exactly like the distance from Normandy to the United Kingdom, or from France to Britain. that we invaded in 1944. That was a highly complex operation. Today we've got helicopters and missiles and things that they didn't have, but it's not easy. It's very complex. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't do it. So just to kind of get into ambiguity of the U.S. policy. So the president has stated 3 times that that the U.S. would defend Taiwan, but official policy has always been ambiguous. We accept the one China policy, but we also say that this reunification must be established peacefully. At the same time, we have the Taiwan Relation Act. Many will say that the TRA requires us to defend Taiwan. Actually, it doesn't. It's much more nebulous. It says that Congress and the president would consult, but definitely that we have an issue, an interest in security, that we maintain de facto relations with the governing authorities on Taiwan, and that this has been, since then, we sell weapons and have military training that we help with the governing authorities on Taiwan. We don't recognize it as a country, but it is a de facto entity. So the U.S. does have a great deal of military power. Just to put this into perspective, and you don't need to understand the details of this, but China has conducted a military buildup so that the 1995 issue where the U.S. sailed 2 carriers through this Taiwan Straits, and there was really at the time nothing that the Chinese military could have done about it. They've designed capabilities so that they could seriously create challenges for the United States to defend Taiwan. Their military effort is what we call anti-access area denial. They have missiles that can strike potentially all the way past Guam, what we call carrier killer missiles, or that could potentially take out U.S. carriers. They have a bunch of shore-to-ship missiles, and it would be an extremely difficult fight. The U.S. military is extremely capable, but so is the Chinese military. Some say that the PRC military has been told, the CIA director recently came out and said this that they may have been told to be ready to seize Taiwan by 2027. So it remains to be seen whether, in fact, there's a difference between being ready to execute and being given the order by Xi Jinping, who centrally controls power, but it is there. Yet another thing to consider is, would the PRC have to invade Taiwan? You don't have to do a Normandy-style invasion. They could potentially blockade Taiwan. This would, however, leave them more vulnerable to U.S. intervention, but it also preserves all the chip-making facilities, for example, on Taiwan, which the U.S. is highly reliant on. So lots of questions on that. That's really my input here. I'll stop sharing slides and interested in where you want to go with the discussion.
Well, that was a lot of input, and it does raise a lot of questions. I'll get one from one of our viewers in just a second, but I really wanted to just ask you the big question of, considering what we're dealing with Russia's invasion in Ukraine, basically being unchecked except by the resistance of the Ukrainians, has that, do you think, emboldened China? And is that one of the reasons it's inching closer to Russia? Because clearly, if Russia can get away with what it's done, maybe it could get away with invading Taiwan.
That's the definite question. There's no doubt that. Hopefully, I'm not sharing slides anymore. But if you could fix that, if I am. But yeah, so there's no doubt that China is closely watching the situation in Ukraine. I think Xi was shocked because I think he felt that Putin was much more capable than the Russian military was. Of course, many U.S. military analysts were as well. So I think they clearly have an interest in us being tied up in Europe. They would have liked to have Russia, have its borders on NATO, but they have seen that Russia faltered. There's really a couple schools of there's 2 schools of thought that really are out there. One is that China has seen how difficult this is. They've seen contemporary warfare, that it's complex, that if the people have the will to fight, then you can think that you have a great military and you can be shocked. The other school of thought is that China is watching very carefully. They'll assume that they can do this better, and they will. They may they may even feel that they need to act more rapidly. So it remains to be seen. The word school's still out.
It is. It's and I have to ask you one other thing, and then I'm going to get to you, Ella. Just considering the difference in attitudes, the U.S. attitude and U.S. foreign policy under Nixon, and the attitude now. Why didn't China just invade when it had a friendly president?
So China did well. So I think Nixon was deliberately balancing the Soviet Union with China, and China didn't. One of the things that kind of came out of the Cold War was we didn't realize how much the Chinese and the Russians, the PRC and the Russians, did not get along. In fact, there were instances where they traded shots in the 70s. So this was an effort to balance them against that. At the same time, Chinese military capabilities have dramatically changed since even 2016, and I don't think they would have had the capability to execute that kind of invasion in that time, and the U.S. could have easily stopped them.
Okay.
It's not as easy today. It's a difficult proposition.
Right. Well, Ella is asking, to what extent can we compare U.S. foreign policy toward Taiwan to that of Ukraine? How should the U.S. walk the line between supporting Taiwan and avoiding emboldening Taiwan to declare independence and force China's hand?
Yeah, so let me take thanks. That's a great question. That's probably the question.
Yeah.
Let's take the easy one first. Surveys have repeatedly shown that most Taiwanese do not favor independence, but at the same time, they do not favor reunification. I think they have a very good interest in the status quo, the way things are. So we increasingly see the people on Taiwan seeing themselves as something different from mainland China, but they're not really ready to, they're not dumb. They definitely are quite aware of the situation across the strait, and that is a red line for China that could potentially lead them to invade. So most are pretty, even though I think most, except now that you've had the current government is of the present Tsai is of the party that has officially espouses independence, but she's very pragmatic, and they are keeping themselves, to keep that status quo. So that's the first part. And I think most of the folks on Taiwan they're quite aware of that, and they're okay with that. The issue remains, what can we learn? It's hard to tell. One of the big clear questions, I think, was there doubt in Russia's mind as to whether NATO would rally to the defense of Ukraine? And I think the president has been quite clear about what he's saying as far as, that's probably what is the reason behind those statements, that the U.S. Would defend Taiwan. And then they've gone back and it depends, but clearly that this is different. There has been, and I think that's just the key. The issue is that that if Taiwan and the mainland can work out their issues, which is frankly very unlikely, that a democratic Taiwan, watching what happened to China or to Hong Kong and China, where they had a supposedly one China policy, that they would seek reunification, but that military reunification is not an option. So I think that's really the U.S. policy, is to make clear that this is different.
Now, we'll come back to what Americans may think about all of this. I really do want to focus on one thing that was brought up in that film, and that was to don't underestimate the issues that the Chinese leadership, let's say but the whole leadership is facing inside the country, from COVID to whatever. But so talk about that. And yet when we hear that, many Americans simply say, well, so what? They can't do anything about it. They may not like it, but what would it take? We saw what happened with Tiananmen Square. What would it take for, to push out Xi?
Yeah, so I think we should be careful about trying to equate the Chinese were pushed to a degree, their COVID measures were nothing like ours. They're extremely draconian. They went on for a long time. Most Americans couldn't comprehend the degree to which they were locked down, and they just said, we've had enough. And that was a message. And Xi understood, he got it, and then he backed off. But I think that's a far cry from trying to remove Xi. The Chinese government has the first security goal of the Chinese is to maintain domestic control. It's the People's Liberation Army, the military force of China, is a party army. They're not, their loyalty is first and foremost to the Chinese Communist Party, not to the nation. He controls all the reins of power. So I think it's on, and the Chinese are quite aware that they live in a security state. So that's a lot to have them suddenly try to seek that. I think there's a long cry from they'd had enough with COVID to removing Xi from power. And the other thing that should be remembered in regard to, we talked about Taiwan, the Senkakus, the South. The Chinese population is tremendously nationalistic. They're very proud. They see themselves as on a rise. The Chinese also control any dissent, so that makes that easier. But you can't discount the fact of Chinese nationalism, and so that is an issue as well.
Well, then, so let's turn now to American nationalism. Turn out, we talk about, what we would do if China invaded Taiwan and all of this, but really, what's the American sentiment toward that? I mean, Americans are skittish about almost anything involving defending someone else and costing our own lives. What do you see American attitudes toward a potential war with China over Taiwan being?
You probably know American attitudes better than I as far as an opinion editor, but I don't know. I think clearly the issue here is that this is definitely it's a vital interest to the United States. The president's declared that it's a major issue that China not seek to military reunify. Should that happen, it would be devastating to the trust of all the countries in the region towards the United States. It would allow China to essentially flank Japan from the south. It would really compromise Japanese national security. You can see that because Japan is undergoing a major military modernization effort, which is a tremendous, considering their constitution, is a dramatic change. They're concerned. They've said that they're concerned about Chinese potential aggression towards China. So I think it is a major, major issue. It is critically important for the United States. And it's not just something way away. It has impact upon our economy, our way of life, and our national security.
So as you look ahead at this, especially considering the Russia and Ukrainian thing, as you look ahead at this, what do you see? I mean, do you forecast that we really could, and the Biden administration could move toward calming the waters, maintaining some sort of stability, at least in the relations, or do you see storm clouds rising?
I think the challenge is the Biden administration is very clearly trying to make it clear to China that any military action towards Taiwan is not a good idea. So deterrence is their focus, and they're trying to make a lot of signals to that degree. So if there was any question of how Russia, obviously, I think if they knew that we were going to arm the Ukrainians to the degree that we are now, and that the entire world, particularly Europe, would give the degree of military supplies that they have, I think they probably would have thought twice. So they're making a very different sort of, okay, in advance, we understand that you're arming, that you're building a military that could take Taiwan. Don't do that. But with that being said, China continues to arm. They're developing their capabilities. This is a major issue. National reunification with Taiwan and territorial sovereignty in general are major issues for them. They're important to their nationalism. They're part of the Chinese dream. So this is not going to go away. It's probably going to get much worse, and it is going to become increasingly challenging over the coming years.
And this dream is deep. It's not just a dream that's up here with the leadership. It's deep into the soul of each Chinese, right? All right. That's
as much as you can say for 1.4 billion people, what is in everybody's soul. But
right.
It's a critical issue. You can't downplay it.
Right. And the Taiwanese, though, let me just say this. If there's a battle of wills, do the Taiwanese have the same type of will to remain independent as the Ukrainians did?
I think the people of Taiwan clearly, value the present state that they're in. You never know in any situation, is a country going to be Afghanistan or is a country going to be Ukraine? But I think we've clearly, they have the example of Ukraine. Everybody in the world's watching. That definitely does provide a clear view of what a democratic country can do when it's under assault. They're under they've got the example of Hong Kong. So really any kind of peaceful route is pretty, as far as maintaining your own system, is pretty clear that that's not going to happen. And if they, they value their way of life, it's a democratic entity. It has a vibrant economy, vibrant culture. So I think they have it would be a challenge. They're not going to just lay down, I don't think.
Okay. Well, we are at the hour now, but before we let you go, I do want you to just tell us, because you're the expert and you're keeping your tabs on this. Are you optimistic about the U.S.-China relationship, or are you pessimistic?
It's both. I'm optimistic in terms of the number one thing is both the U.S. and China both we gained tremendously. When you look at the Soviet Union and the United States, which did not go to war, we had a lot of brush fire conflicts throughout the Cold War, but ultimately we didn't go to war. We are interlinked with the Chinese economy to a massive degree, and they're aware of that. They don't want to have so there would be tremendous costs. With that being said, as our speaker said, Russia was they knew that they are not interlinked with the West to the same degree. But they did choose to intervene. The world in 1914, one of the things I learned a few years ago was the world was interlinked in 1914 to a degree that really didn't happen economically interdependent until the 80s. Now we're certainly much more interdependent now. We all do gain from supply chains that are tied together, competitive advantage. But sometimes countries do things for other reasons. And so it's going to be a challenging decade ahead.
And sometimes they could just have bad leaders too focused on ideology and not on basically global stability. So with that, I want to thank you, Colonel Harper, for sharing with us, for being with us tonight. And I want to thank those who tuned in here directly to participate, and all those who tuned in or tuning in on Facebook as well. And we do hope to have you back, and we hope things, of course, get better between the United States and China. So with that, please enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.